There was a gold rush in San Diego in the 1800s in a little town called Julian up in the mountains. The main street in Julian is about 3 blocks long. It still is. You can go visit it still today. And right in the middle of Main Street was a building with a sign across the top that said Julian Mining Company. And down in the window, a smaller sign said, hiring hard workers. Well, Elizabeth walked through that door and she said, I'm a hard worker. Hire me. And the man sitting behind the desk said, you're a lady. And Elizabeth said, well, that really depends on who you ask. But I'm a hard worker no matter what's in my pants. And she was wearing pants. She had pulled on a pair of her dead husband's trousers. She'd had to poke extra holes in the belt to get him to stay on, but they were staying on today. Now the man with the cigar said, nah, I won't be responsible for ruining a lady's soft hands. And she held out her hands. They were calloused. The knuckles were cracked. Her skin was red. And she said, sir, I have been raising 6 kids by myself. Ain't nobody come through that much laundry with soft hands. And she got the job. Now, her first day working in the mines, all of the men made jokes about how she should be in the galley. She should be making them sandwiches. But she persisted. And that only lasted about half a day until they realized that she was outworking every single one of them combined. And from that point forward, they called her Lady Gray. Lady because, well, and gray because that was the color everybody was after a day in the mines. Now, the time passed on, and this was one of those years when Christmas fell on a Sunday, which was their only day off from the mines. So on Christmas Eve, the day before, Elizabeth was walking to the mine to get to work, and her pocket, well, it was jingling for the first time in a very, very long time. Because you see, they had never hired a woman to work in the mines before, and it didn't occur to any of them to pay her less. So here she was with a pocket jingling, Christmas tomorrow, 6 kids at home. She decides she's going to stop into the market. And she looks around, see what's there, and there amid the sad winter lettuces and the pumpkins that were getting a little squishy from October, she found 3 still perfect, unbruised apples from the fall harvest. The skin was still shiny. They were perfectly round. They were a penny each. And a penny's a dear price for an apple in those days. But she reached into her pocket and she passed it over. And she knew that her kids would split these apples and they would have a feast for Christmas. Well, she made her way to the mine, and today she'd been assigned to work in sort of an offshoot mine with just a small team. It was Junior, who had made his way from Texas all by himself, and everyone was pretty sure that he had lied about his age to get this job because his voice still cracked when he got excited. Howdy! So it was Elizabeth and Junior and old Tom. Now, old Tom didn't really talk in words or sentences very much. He mostly just communicated in grunts. Well, they get to work, they arrive, they're getting their stuff going, and Junior was never really comfortable with silences. So it wasn't very long before he asked, Lady Gray, what are you getting your kids for Christmas? And Lady Gray said, I got them, the breath in their lungs, and the clothes on their back. I raised them right. They know that's enough. And then she set her axe down and she said, but I also got them a couple of apples for Christmas. We fatted up a rooster. We're going to have a feast tomorrow. And Junior said, oh, that sounds great, Lady Gray. And just then old Tom passed down behind them and they heard the clunk as something fell out of one of his pockets. Well, Junior reached down and he scooped it up. It was like a little burlap bag. And Tom turned around and swiped it out of Junior's hand and said, keep your hands to yourself, boy. And Junior said, sure, old Tom, no problem. But old Tom, why are you carrying around a whole sack full of gold nuggets? Because you see, you don't work in the mines very long without knowing what a little sack of gold nuggets feels like from the outside. Tom said, well, getting out of here, taking everything with me. Tonight, I'm going to get on that supply wagon down to the coast. Never going to step foot in a mine ever again. And Junior said, gee, that's great, old Tom. And Elizabeth was thinking this was the most words she had ever heard old Tom speak. He must be in great spirits. Well, they work the day through and they're ready to leave the mine. So they kind of pack up their wheelbarrows. They got their sacks on their back and they lift up those barrows and they get themselves out to the exit. And now see, when they had come in, the world had been dusty brown and dark pine tree green of the mountains up there in Julian. But now everything was white. At least 10 inches of snow had fallen while they had been working. Old Tom said, ain't none of us leaving in that. We wouldn't make it 100 feet before you got lost, because you see the snow was still falling thick and hard. Old Tom turned and he dove back into the mine, and Junior said, "Oh no, Old Tom, you're gonna miss your supply wagon." And Elizabeth said, "Well, better to catch next week's supply wagon than turn into a miner popsicle out here." And she turned and she went back into the mine, and Junior said, "But Lady Gray, it's Christmas tomorrow, your kids." Well, they started a small fire right in the center of kind of like an open space. They made it deep enough back in the mines where the draft from the snowstorm wasn't too bad anymore. Made a little fire, kind of warm things up a little bit. And they all settled themselves. They wrapped as much as they could around them. And they each found a dryish spot on the wall. Junior over here, Elizabeth over here, Old Tom over here. And you could hear the tinkle of water running through the cracks in the rocks. It was cold. It smelled like dust. And then there was the sound of almost like rainfall, like an alto rattlesnake. And Junior had dug into his bag and he pulled out a sack and he set it down. And he said, "My mama sent these with me from Texas, and I've been eating one at a time when I get homesick, but, well, it's Christmas Eve, and I think this is the only food we got here, so we might as well." And he opened the sack, and it glowed warm brown. It was full of shining pecans. He grabbed a handful of them and set them on the ground, raised that pickaxe like he was going to go after them. And Elizabeth said, "Wait, those pecans, it's not the only food we got here." And she reached into her bag, opened it up, and the scent of apples filled the mine, along with a little bit of that fire smoke and this smell of the wet dust. And she pulled out those shining apples. And Junior said, but Lady Gray, those apples is for your kids." And Elizabeth said, "I raised my kids right. If they knew that there were hungry mouths in front of me right now and I had saved these apples instead of feeding us, my kids wouldn't want those apples." And she said to handing them out, one to Junior, one for herself, one to Old Tom. And Old Tom said, "Wait." And he reached into his breast pocket and he pulled out that little sack of gold nuggets. And from inside, he pulled a little twist of paper and he gave it a sniff and then handed it over to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth said, "What are you about, Old Tom?" And she gave it a sniff. "Cinnamon and nutmeg? Oh, Tom, you dog." And Tom said, "Yeah, there's some ginger in there too. I was saving them for somebody else, but you're right. If she knew we were in here tonight, she wouldn't want those spices." Well, they set to cutting up those apples and they put them in a little tin can right next to the fire. They cracked open those pecans and kind of crumbled them up and put them on over the apples. And then they took that paper twist and they sprinkled it over the whole thing. And pretty soon that mine smelled still a little bit like dust, but also like warm family home. Well, they reached in with spoons. Their spoons kind of clacked against each other as they reached in. They just ate straight out of the can until their bellies were just a little more full than they had been. Then Old Tom reached back into his pocket. He pulled out that sack again and he poured those gold nuggets into his palm. It glowed like melted sunlight in his hand. And he picked up one of those nuggets and he told him about he had found this nugget when he was out with Toothless Jack. And then he told him about this one, about Poncho the Horse Whisperer, and how a horse had dug this gold nugget out of a stone all by itself. And about how this one, he had panned a whole creek bed dry and then turned around to find this one the size of his thumb in the hands of a ground squirrel. Well, he told them story after story, and they laughed, and they shared stories of their own. And somehow, in the telling and in the laughing and in the sharing, it became Christmas in that mine. Well, they got a little tired, ran a little bit out of stories, and they settled next to each other, shoulder to shoulder against a dry spot in the wall, and settled into sleep. The firelight was dimming, and it sparkled all of the wet walls of that mine into like starlight. And the tinkling of water falling down through the cracks in the rocks sounded a lot like silver bells. The next morning they got up, they said their goodbyes, and they made their way out. It had stopped snowing. They made their way out and they left 3 separate tracks of footprints in the snow go in different directions. Elizabeth reached into her pocket for her glove and she felt there was something else in her pocket. She reached down deep and she pulled out 7 perfect pecans. She put that glove on and she reached into for her other one, and well, her other pocket wasn't empty either. She reached in and she pulled out a rough ball just about the size of her pinky nail, and against that pure white snow, it glowed like gold, because it was gold. Well, Elizabeth laughed and she sang Christmas carols all the way home to her kids.